In 1879, a cook named George W. Scott loaded provisions onto the Gloucester schooner Ocean King for a 4-month voyage to the Grand Banks. 5 barrels of beef, 1 barrel of pork, 10 barrels of flour, 50 gallons of molasses, 200 pounds of butter. That was everything for 12 men for 16 weeks on the North Atlantic. Between 1830 and 1900, 3,800 Gloucester fishermen drowned at sea. More than 5,000 sailed out and never came back. Number 14 on this list was born on a fishing boat and is now served at presidential inaugurations. Number 8 was so abundant it washed ashore in 2-foot piles, and they fed it to prisoners. Number 1 was the meal a fisherman carried in his head for 16 weeks straight. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man meals from America's deadliest fishing ports. Number 25. Hardtack. Ship's biscuit. Worm castle. Dense squares of flour and water, baked until every molecule of moisture was gone. The Navy issued 14 ounces per man per day. Some biscuits were decades old at issue. Records exist of hardtack 40 years after baking. By then, the weevils had moved in. Fishermen learned to eat it in the dark so they did not have to watch what crawled out. Others tapped it on the table to knock the bugs loose. You soaked it in coffee or crumbled it into stew to make it chewable. That was the entire job description of hardtack. Keep a man alive between Gloucester and the Grand Banks. Number 24. Salt beef from the barrel. Chunks of beef were preserved in brine until the meat turned gray and hard as shoe leather. The cook soaked it overnight in fresh water to draw out the salt, then boiled it. It was stringy, tough, and it tasted as if the ocean had already digested it once. Fishermen joked it was so hard you could carve buttons from it. It sat in oak barrels below deck for months. The brine turned dark and foul. The cook reached in with bare hands and pulled out a gray slab. That was Tuesday, and Thursday, and most of the trip. Number 23rd, salt pork, the other barrel. Fattier, cheaper, slightly less miserable because the fat rendered and gave you something resembling flavor. 1 barrel for 12 men for 16 weeks. The cook sliced it thin for breakfast, cubed it into the bean pot for supper, rendered the fat and fried everything else in it. Salt pork was not a meal. It was an ingredient, the foundation under every dish. Without it, everything tasted like nothing. With it, everything tasted like salt and pork fat. Those were your options on the North Atlantic. Number 22, baked beans. Cheap, they lasted forever, and they filled a man's belly when the sea was rough and nothing else stayed down. The cook soaked them overnight, boiled them with salt pork and molasses, and served them in tin bowls that slid across the table when the boat rolled. Beans and brown bread were Saturday supper in every port town from Gloucester to Portland. On the boat, it was any night the cook had beans and molasses left. 50 gallons of molasses went aboard the Ocean King. Most went into the bean pot. Number 21, boiled dinner. Salt beef or pork, boiled with potatoes, turnips, cabbage, and onions. Everything in one pot. Everything came out gray. The galley on a Gloucester schooner was a closet with a wood stove bolted to the deck. The cook worked while the boat pitched through the North Atlantic swells. Pots slid, grease jumped. A galley burn was the most common injury after hook wounds. The boiled dinner tasted the same every time because the ingredients never changed. Potatoes and turnips were the only vegetables that survived weeks at sea. Number 20, fried potatoes. 15 bushels for 4 months. Sliced thick and fried in salt pork drippings. Potatoes were the one food every man looked forward to because they tasted like something that grew in dirt instead of something that sat in brine. When the potatoes ran out, morale dropped. The cook who rationed them well, who made them last deep into the trip when everything else had gone stale, was the cook who kept his crew working. First pattern break. Commercial fishermen did not eat their own catch. The fish was their paycheck. Every cod they ate was a cod they could not sell. Gloucester fishermen were not paid wages. They were paid in shares. At the end of the trip, the catch was sold, expenses deducted, and whatever was left got divided among the crew. A man who ate his own fish was eating his children's shoes, his wife's grocery bill, his rent. So the men who spent 16 weeks on the most abundant fishing grounds on earth ate salt beef and hardtack, while the cod was salted and stacked in the hold below their feet. A schooner full of cod was worth a fortune. The men who caught it ate like paupers. You fished to sell. You survived on what the cook loaded in barrels before you left. The sea was full of food. None of it was yours. Number 19. Coffee. Black, bitter, bottomless. The pot lived on the galley stove 24 hours a day. A man off watch at 2 a.m. poured a cup before anything else. A man heading out to haul trawl at 4 poured one, standing in the companionway with one hand on the rail. Coffee was the only thing always hot and always available. Nobody complained about it. Complaining about coffee on a fishing boat was bad luck. Everything was bad luck on a fishing boat. Whistling, women, bananas. But the coffee was beyond superstition. The coffee was survival. Number 18. Duff. Dense boiled raisin pudding. Flour, water, suet, and raisins when the cook had any. The ingredients were mixed into a heavy dough, wrapped in cloth, and boiled for 2 hours. It came out dense and steaming, sliced with a knife, and served with molasses. Duff was the closest thing to dessert at sea. On a good day, it appeared after supper, and the forecastle went quiet while 12 men ate something sweet for the first time in days. On a bad day, it did not appear, and nobody mentioned it. Number 17. Fish hash. On the rare occasion the cook used fresh catch, a fish too small or damaged to sell, he chopped it with leftover potatoes and onions and fried the mess in salt pork fat. Fish hash was the cleanup meal, the apology for a bad week of salt beef. Nobody complained. It was the best thing on the boat because it was the only thing that was fresh. One piece of haddock fried with potatoes 200 miles from shore tasted better than any restaurant meal in Boston. Number 16. Siabo, tongues and cheeks. The parts the buyers did not want. When the crew dressed the catch, splitting and salting the fish for the hold, the tongues and cheeks were set aside for the cook. These small tender pieces of meat were the fisherman's secret. Dipped in flour and fried in butter or pork fat, cod tongues had a texture closer to scallops than to fish. The cheeks were rich and sweet. In Gloucester and the maritime provinces, cod tongues and cheeks are still considered a delicacy by people who grew up in fishing families. To everyone else, they are invisible. The best part of the fish, known only to the men who caught it and the women who married them. Number 15. Pilot bread. In 1792, John Pearson opened a bakery in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and started producing a refined version of hardtack specifically for fishermen and sailors departing from New England ports. He called it pilot bread, the same idea as hardtack, but slightly less brutal on the teeth. Thinner, lighter, made with a touch of shortening that regular hardtack never had. Pilot bread replaced hardtack on most fishing schooners by the mid-1800s. Fishermen crumbled it into chowder the same way their fathers crumbled hardtack. The Pearson Bakery eventually inspired what we now know as oyster crackers. Every time you drop those little round crackers into a bowl of clam chowder, you are eating a direct descendant of the pilot bread that fishermen carried to the Grand Banks. Number 14. Chowder. Born on a fishing boat. The oldest known printed recipe appeared in the Boston Evening Post on September 23rd. 1751. But the dish existed long before anyone wrote it down. French and British fishermen off Newfoundland threw whatever they had into a pot. Hardtack, crumbled fine, salt cod or fresh catch, water, onions when they had them. That was the original chowder. No cream, no potatoes, no clams. just hard bread dissolved in fish broth to make something thick enough to fill a man's stomach on a rolling deck. The word itself probably comes from the French chaudière, the large iron pot that fishermen cooked in. Over the next century, potatoes replaced hardtack. Milk and cream arrived. Clams entered the picture. Salt pork fat became the base, never bacon. The fishermen's wives in Gloucester were adamant about that. Salt pork is the only proper fat for chowder because it lets the fish flavor stand out. Bacon overpowers it. That argument is still happening in kitchens across New England right now, and chowder is still being served at presidential inaugurations. A dish that started in a pot on a fishing boat in the North Atlantic ended up at the White House. The fisherman who invented it never knew. Second pattern break. In colonial New England, lobster washed ashore in piles 2 feet high after storms along the Massachusetts coast. They were so abundant and so common that colonists called them the cockroach of the sea. Lobster shells around your house were signs of poverty and degradation. The creatures were fed to prisoners, apprentices, servants, and slaves. They were ground up and used as fertilizer. They were chopped and used as fish bait. Nobody wanted to eat them. In 1623, William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote a letter complaining that the best meal they could manage was a lobster or a piece of fish without bread. That was his apology to the investors back in England. We are so poor that we are eating lobster. Now walk into any restaurant in Boston and order one, $60 a plate, $80 with sides. The animal that colonists were embarrassed to eat is now the most expensive item on the menu. The food that fishermen threw back into the sea or used to bait their hooks is served on white tablecloths with drawn butter and a lemon wedge. Nothing in the history of American food has traveled further from the bottom to the top than the lobster. And the fishermen who used to curse when they found one tangled in their nets are the ones whose grandchildren now make a living catching them. Number 13, codfish cakes. When a fisherman came home from a trip, there was salt cod in every cupboard in Gloucester. The wives mixed it with mashed potatoes, onion, and egg, shaped the mixture into patties, and fried them in lard. Codfish cakes were the fisherman's first real meal back on land. Hot, crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and made by someone who loved you in a kitchen that did not move. Every fishing family in New England had their own recipe. Some added a pinch of mustard. Some used cracker crumbs. The argument over the correct ratio of cod to potato has been running for 200 years and will never be settled. Codfish cakes for Sunday breakfast with baked beans was the standard meal in Massachusetts fishing towns from the 1700s through the middle of the 20th century. Number 12, biscuits from the galley. Sea-baked morning comfort, not hardtack, real biscuits. On a schooner with a good cook, fresh biscuits came out of the galley oven every morning. Flour, lard, baking powder, salt. 15 minutes in a hot oven on a rolling sea. The trick was timing the oven door to the swells so the biscuits did not slide off the rack. A good galley cook could produce biscuits in a gale. A bad one could not produce them in a calm. The difference mattered because fresh biscuits with molasses at breakfast told the crew that the cook was competent and the trip was going to be bearable. Cold hardtack at breakfast told them the opposite. Number 11, clam chowder from the shore. When the fleet was in, the women cooked. Clams dug from the flats at low tide, chopped and simmered with potatoes, salt pork, and milk. Not the heavy cream restaurant version. Thin, milky, loaded with clams, eaten with pilot crackers at a kitchen table by a man who had not been home in 6 weeks. The first bowl went fast. The second went slow. The third was the one where the fisherman stopped moving, sat still, looked at his wife, and remembered why he went to sea. Number 10, baked cod with salt pork and potatoes. A filet in a baking dish topped with strips of salt pork, surrounded by sliced potatoes, baked until the fat rendered and coated everything. Friday supper in every Catholic fishing town. Not because it was good, though it was, because the church said no meat on Friday, and the harbor was full of cod, and a woman who had spent the week alone waiting for a boat could make it with her eyes closed. Number 9. Molasses on everything. 50 gallons for 4 months. On biscuits for breakfast. In beans for supper. In coffee when a man needed something sweet on a 12-hour watch. Molasses was cheap because it arrived by the shipload from the Caribbean, the same Caribbean that New England's salt cod was shipped to. The triangle trade built both the economy and the fisherman's diet. His cod went south. The molasses came north. He poured it on his bread and went back to sea. Number 8. Lobster from the trap. Before the luxury, before $60 a plate, lobster was a nuisance. Fishermen threw them back or kept them for bait. The ones they brought home were boiled on the kitchen stove and eaten with bare hands. No drawn butter, no lemon, just a boiled bug cracked open by a man whose fingers were already cut and swollen from hooks. His wife ate one. The children fought over the claws. Shells went to the garden as fertilizer the next morning. That was Tuesday dinner in Gloucester in 1860. Nobody called it fine dining. Third pattern break. Between 1830 and 1900, 3,800 Gloucester fishermen were lost at sea. More than 5,000 sailed out and never returned. The Portland gale of 1898 destroyed 150 vessels in a single night. Dory fishermen feared fog more than storms. A man in a 20-foot boat, 2 miles from his schooner when the fog rolled in, had no compass, no radio, no way to find his ship. He rowed and shouted and blew a horn. Some were picked up. Some rowed for days. Some disappeared and their dories washed up empty on beaches in Nova Scotia. Every meal on this list was eaten by men who knew they might not come back. Every bowl of chowder, every cup of coffee at 4 in the morning was consumed by someone who had accepted a bargain no modern worker would take. You fish, you might die. You eat what we give you. The pay comes at the end if you make it home. Number 7. Fish and brewis, the Newfoundland fisherman's staple. Hard bread soaked overnight until soft, then boiled and served alongside salt cod that had been soaked and boiled separately. The two were mixed together on the plate with scrunchions, small pieces of salt pork fat fried until crispy, and poured over the top with the rendered fat. Fish and brewis was the meal that connected New England fishermen to their Newfoundland counterparts. Both groups ate the same thing because both groups had access to the same ingredients: hard bread, salt cod, salt pork. The holy trinity of the North Atlantic fishery. Every fishing culture, from the Basques to the Portuguese to the Nova Scotians, built their cuisine around those three things. Fish and brewis is still served in Newfoundland today. The recipe has not changed in 300 years because the recipe was already perfect. Number 6. Salt cod soaked and fried. A piece of dried cod soaked for 24 to 48 hours, changing the water multiple times, dredged in flour, fried in pork fat, and served with boiled potatoes. Wednesday supper and Saturday supper in every fishing town, where salt cod was more common than bread. Dried cod was 80% protein. It lasted months. It was New England's first export and its first source of wealth. William Pitt called it British gold. The families who got rich selling it were the codfish aristocracy. The fishermen who caught it ate the pieces too small to sell. Same fish, same ocean, different tables. Number 5. Johnny cake. Cornmeal mixed with water, salted and fried on a hot griddle. Fishing families from Rhode Island to Maine ate them because cornmeal was cheap, and they could be made in 5 minutes. The name probably comes from journey cake, a portable version fishermen carried wrapped in cloth. A cold Johnny cake in a coat pocket on a fishing boat was the New England version of the lumberjack's cold donut. They were fuel, dense, and eaten standing up in weather that made sitting dangerous. Number 4. Fisherman's platter. When the catch came in and the men had money for the first time in weeks, the waterfront restaurants served everything at once: fried cod, fried clams, fried scallops, fried shrimp, coleslaw, fries, and a cold beer. The fisherman's platter was the reward meal, the one you ate when the trip was done, when the fish was sold, when you were alive, and your share was in your pocket. Nobody ate this at sea. It was a shore meal, proof that the ocean had let you come home one more time. Number 3, New England clam bake. The technique came from the Wampanoag, who dug pits on the beach, heated stones with fire, and layered clams, lobster, corn, and seaweed over the hot rocks. Fishing communities held clam bakes to mark the end of the season, the 4th of July, and any excuse to cook on the beach. A proper clam bake takes hours. You dig. You burn wood to heat the stones. You layer seaweed, clams, lobster, corn, more seaweed, canvas. You wait. When you pull back the tarp, the smell hits before the food. Salt air, seaweed, shellfish, and corn. That smell is the Massachusetts coast. It existed before the first European ship, and it still exists in backyards every summer. Number 2, the cook's last breakfast before sailing. The morning a schooner left Gloucester, the cook was the first man aboard. He had loaded the barrels, checked the stove, and stocked the galley. Before the crew arrived, before the lines were cast, he made breakfast: biscuits, fried potatoes, salt pork, coffee. The last meal in a harbor that was not moving. The last meal where pots stayed on the stove and the floor did not tilt. That final harbor breakfast was the cook's private ritual. His way of saying the galley is ready, and whatever happens, the men will eat. In a profession where 5,000 men never came home, that promise was everything. Number 1, the meal waiting at home. Every fisherman on every schooner that ever sailed out of Gloucester carried the same thing in his head. Not the salt beef, not the hardtack, not the beans or the coffee or the cod. The meal his wife would make when he walked through the door. Cod cakes on a Sunday morning, chowder thick with clams, baked beans with brown bread on a Saturday night, a plate of food on a table that did not move, in a kitchen that smelled like home instead of brine and bilge water. That meal was the reason he went. Not the money, though he needed it. Not the adventure, though he was young. The meal at home. The one that meant the trip was over, the sea had given him back, and his wife had set an extra plate because she heard the fleet was in, and maybe this time he was on one of them. 16 weeks of salt and cold and fog and the constant knowledge that the boat under his feet could go down at any moment. The thing that carried him through all of it was the memory of a kitchen table, a woman who cooked for him, and children who ran to the door when they heard his boots on the step. That meal, the one waiting at home, is number 1 on this list, because it was number 1 in the heart of every man who ever fished the Grand Banks. And for the 5,000 who never tasted it again, it remains the most important meal that was never eaten. Try one this week. Make a chowder, the fisherman's kind. Salt pork rendered in a pot, onions softened in the fat, potatoes simmered until tender, fresh white fish broken into chunks at the end, milk, salt, pepper, oyster crackers on the side. Tell me in the comments if your family fished. Gloucester, New Bedford, Portland, Provincetown, Rockport. Tell me what your grandmother made when the boats came in. Tell me if your grandfather ever talked about the galley or the cook or the fog. Those schooners are gone, and the men who sailed them are almost gone too. But the chowder is still here. It still tastes like the ocean. It still tastes like home.